Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a realm where reality intertwines with the inexplicable, where the boundaries of reason dissolve into the shadows of uncertainty. Welcome to the political twilight zone. I am your guide through this enigmatic labyrinth, where politics and power take on life of their own. In this dimension, the threads of truth weave a tapestry of intrigue, challenging our perception of the world we thought we knew. In this world, nothing is as it seems, and the truth lies buried beneath layers of deceit. Prepare to venture where reason meets the unexplained, and where the unexplained might just be the ultimate.
Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me again this weekend on Getting It Right here with Rick Wagner. And it is a pleasure to be with you here on KNZZ, KGLN, as well as the internet and podcasting and a couple of little places. We really appreciate it. Don't forget to visit our website if you'd like to. I've noticed a lot more people have been going to it. We've had some interesting news on it. It's at the politicalviking.com or therickwagnershow.com, or the old one we've had for a long time, thewaronwrong.com. Any one of those three will get you to the page. And we have a lot of news in there that updates frequently, some stuff in the middle that I like to put up because I find it interesting, or maybe I've written it or something. And then we have a link there to Victor Hansen's podcast. If you want to, you can just click on it right there and listen to it. Updates like 3 times a week. And then just some interesting stuff on the side. You can take a perusal if you want. So, interesting week, huh? Yeah. How fast things can change in the world of politics and apex predators, as it were. The Elon Trump thing, I don't think many people didn't think something was going to happen at some point, just because you have two super successful people, big egos, used to getting their way. They're just going to, at some point, they're going to butt heads. Now, it gets wild fast, but it's sort of like, for those of you that are familiar with the Rocky Mountain sheep, you'll realize that many times if you're in the mountains and you're lucky enough to be near some of these critters, you'll hear these really loud bangs come across. Well, that's how the Rams settled their problems. They're both dominant. They want to see who's the boss. And so they run at each other and bang their horns into each other, pretty much their head too, and it's quite loud. And you can hear it a lot of places. Yeah, the same thing happens with some elk sometimes. Get into it. It's just, that's the nature of the world sometimes. I think if you put two male lions together for a while, sooner or later they're going to have a disagreement about something. And neither one of them is wired to a situation of, I don't know. They're not wired to a situation of backing down or giving up or saying, oh, that's all right. They're wired to say, you need to do what I say. And when you get to them like that, it's tough. Am I upset with Elon? A little, but not too much. I mean, I think Elon went off pretty hard, pretty fast. But at the same time, I think the president, in his way, it's just his way, kind of diminished Elon because Elon was complaining about the bill, and it just went back and forth. And it's one of those things, where the joke is on some show when something went crazy and someone says, well, that escalated quickly, didn't it? That's kind of like what happened here. I mean, before you know it, they're both saying crazy things. I don't think that Elon's major problem was the EV credit. Because if you look at what was being discussed before this bill went in, months ago, there was discussion about the tax credit on EVs. And of all the EV manufacturers, Tesla needs it the least. They don't lose money on their cars. Almost everybody else, all the American manufacturers, lose money when they manufacture an electric car. Tesla makes money. I mean, it's nice to entice people with it, but it wasn't as harmful to them. So I don't think that was at the bottom of it. And I don't think that Elon needed to threaten to decommission Dragon ship so that to let NASA do their own thing. Fine. If you want to pull my contracts or say bad things about me, just, I'll take my rocket and go home. And that's not a good way to do things either. At the same time, people encouraging Trump to seize SpaceX and deport Elon and all this stuff. Now that's, if you want to make yourself look bad, say nothing about it. I think it ethically is wrong. That's a way to do it. I mean, you don't seize people's companies because you don't like what they said about something. Some of you may disagree with me on that. I understand. But that's a bridge too far. And it's the kind of rhetoric that lets the left point to the right and say, see what they are? They're going to try and take over everything. Well, the fact that the left has been trying to take over everything since the FDR, it seems to elude them, but they're happy to say that about the Republicans. So you have to be careful with that. So both sides haven't exactly made themselves look great, but you can't have big dogs like that fighting and not have a lot of dust in the air. So I think it might work itself out a little bit here, but we don't want to have Trump get too distracted. He's got a lot of other things to do, and we don't want to have Elon get distracted. He is, in many ways, the prime mover of a whole lot of technology in this country, and not just because he wants to make more money. I'm sure he does want to make some money. But he's not really motivated by that, I don't think, if you really study him as much as some of these other guys are. I mean, look at the way he lives. I'm not aware that he owns a house. I think he was thinking about buying one. He sold all his properties several years ago when he was trying to start another company, trying to start SpaceX, I think. I'm not aware that he has a private jet. He may, but it certainly isn't going to be as luxurious as some other people do. I'm not aware that he has 2 or 3 of these yachts like Bezos has, these giant $230 million or almost near $1 billion yachts, drifting around. He doesn't have any of that stuff. He is focused on some other things. I mean, this is a guy that, when they were starting the Tesla plant, was sleeping under his desk at the plant. Not because he was trying to show how great he was or anything, but because that's how he operates. He has that sort of focused in, it's not fun to be him, I don't think, actually, way of operation. And he needs to focus on something. So he needs to get back to doing that. He'll come up with stuff, a lot of stuff that'll be good for the country. Let's just, this is where the referee comes in, has everybody go to their neutral corner, sit down on the stool, maybe get somebody wipe their face with some water and, that kind of stuff. And then maybe just ring the bell and call the fight off. Anyway. So we're going to have to see how that turns out. I mean, the left, I've been reading their stuff. They love this. Because the left is afraid of both Trump and Musk. Because they can't predict Trump, and he's been successful in a lot of things. The same thing with Musk. He's been very successful. They liked him when he wasn't saying anything, and then now when he worries about spending money, they hate him. But the fact that he kind of doesn't care that much really infuriates him. Trump and Musk have that in common, right? Is they don't care that much about what people say about them, and that kind of thing, it goes a long ways with keeping people from hurting you, because you can say, "Hey, I don't care what you think." That doesn't mean you don't take some hits. Doesn't mean people don't set your dealerships on fire or key your customers' cars or any of that other kind of ridiculous crap. But what it means is that I don't live for your opinion. And if a person can get to that point about most of the world, you're really in pretty good shape. Because living for the way other people think about you is a road that will put you on a very depressing path at some point. The idea that you believe your own press when it's good, well, that means you're going to believe it when it's bad. And most of the time, it isn't true either way, or certainly not as true. So, it's those guys have that in common. But we have a lot of other things percolating away out there. And I'll talk about a couple of them here in the next segment. I want to talk a little bit about the big, beautiful bill. There's some issues with it. I understand why some of the folks are not crazy about it. I understand why Musk isn't, and some of it because fundamentally he doesn't understand how Washington works. It's a little bit like how Trump was in his first term. He doesn't understand that slowing the rate of growth is cutting in government talk. Okay, we'll be back in a minute. Yeah, we're stuck in the middle of a lot of things going on here. I thought we'd talk a little bit about the big, beautiful bill, but not so much about exactly what was in it, because we keep hearing bits and pieces of it. It's huge. It does a whole lot of things. It keeps the tax cuts in place that Trump had from the first administration. The president put in at those. It also removes tax from a number of things. Tips, as we know, overtime. They're trying to put something in that's specifically overtime for law enforcement officers. They're messing around with going back and forth with the idea of taking tax off Social Security payments. This is all fine, but that's a lot of revenue. And if you've listened to me before, you know, I hate this idea like, how do we pay for the tax cuts? Well, you try and cut taxes and increase productivity. And that's usually what happens. We talk about the Laffer curve and how at some point there is, if not an exact sweet spot, but an area where you take enough to run a government to do the job you're looking for and leave enough for an economy to churn out more money, more domestic product, more things to sell. The whole thing churning along. If you take too much out, then the economy slows down. You become just government, and pretty soon everybody's living in, big concrete buildings with little caves of steel in them. If you don't take enough, then you run into the problem a little bit like the Continental Congress had, where they not only didn't have any power, but they didn't have money. I mean, you may remember the old saying that if you learned in school that people would say it's not worth a Continental. It's because the money wouldn't worth anything. So you have to have enough money to do a few things. As much as we dislike the way government does many things, we have to realize that you need some of it. So that area, it isn't necessarily a point, but it appears to be kind of like an area of, let's say, monetary collection and expenditure. And of course, you have to decide what you're spending it on. Now, you can have the same amount of money collected and spend it on things like, Peruvian comic books and Sesame Street in Gaza or whatever the case may be. None of that really helps the economy go along. Now, the purpose of the governmental money isn't just to pump it back into, if you're Keynesian, you kind of think this way. It's not just to pump government money back into everything, you're creating sort of a perpetual motion machine. I don't care what Keynes says, and he's much smarter than I am. But again and again, that kind of thing is just a short-term fix. It's a little bit like priming the pump, or if you had a carburetor in the old days. You'll have to ask, good old Tim Walls about this, because, he's a real man. He knows how to fix all this kind of stuff. He knows what a carburetor is. You used to put a accelerant in carburetors when they wouldn't start to kind of get things clicking and going, particularly when it was cold or something like that. Well, to the extent that works occasionally with governmental funds, yeah, that kind of works in the Keynesian sense. If you think you can run your whole economy like that forever, no one's ever been able to do that. So this is why the Keynesian point was when they say, well, yeah, but what about the long run? And, Keynes' answer was, well, in the long run, we're all dead. Well, all of the people now are dead, but not the people that are carrying on. So what does that even mean? So you only care about yourself? Is that? I've often wondered about that. But the point is that you have to see that the government has to operate in a way that accentuates the ability of the economy to function at its highest possible level. That's kind of what government's supposed to be. And to do that, you have to make people safe. That's the first thing. People don't produce when they're not safe, when they don't have law, when they don't have protection. They don't produce anything. They try not to get killed. That doesn't put people to work. So all of these things sort of fall in line. Unfortunately, government has gotten complicated about the way it gets money. In the old days, we just collected a bunch of gold And then we gave gold out for things we needed until we ran out, in which case then we started the old plan of borrowing it. And people have been borrowing money for government since, it's really been going on a lot since, I don't know, maybe the 6th or 7th century. Yeah, that's when, we start seeing some quasi-nation states start borrowing money, essentially feudal principalities and so forth to do things. Borrowing money back and forth for countries to keep going was not exactly a new idea. It's always been going on a little bit, but we really started getting into it in that point. Well, our economy now, at least in this country, is a juggernaut, and not in necessarily a good way. It careens around if we don't keep some control on it, and smashes into things like interest rates, mortgages, things like that. While we sit and try and come up with this budget bill, the economy, the country, the government, is not just standing still. While we're looking at trying to pass this big, beautiful bill, and it's got some spending in it, it's going to raise national debt. Let's not kid ourselves. That's why part of it has to be to take the debt ceiling off, which, frankly, the president says, let's get rid of the debt ceiling. And I would say this. If you're going to keep raising the debt ceiling like it's not counting for anything, then just get rid of it. Just don't stop pretending. But anyway, in the meantime, we have short-term government funding that is just being spent, right? While this budget is not being put in place. And there's a thing called the Treasury General Account. It's a financial tool. It's comparable to the government's checking account. And it's being depleted while Congress delays this budget and debt ceiling resolution. This, let's call it the TGA. It's critical for covering immediate federal expenditures, Social Security, defense contracts, all that kind of stuff. It is currently underfunded because the Treasury is unable to issue new debt beyond the statutory limit. Sad that it has to be new debt, but anyway. So the Treasury Secretary has resorted to drawing down this fund to keep the government functioning. In other words, they just keep writing checks out of it. The Congress continues to not lift the debt ceiling, the more Treasury must rely on this checking account, which, as we know, doesn't go on forever. It shrinks the pool of available cash, increases the amount that must be raised once borrowing is authorized again. Some people on the bear side of the political market, of the stock market, are not wrong about the fact that this is a way to push the economy down if you don't get going. Because it could force the Treasury to flood the bond market with hundreds of billions of new debt all at once, because that's what the bonds are. They need money. So they go out and they sell you the bond. 3-month bond, 6-month bond, 2-year bond, 10-year bond. And to get you to buy that and give them the money, they guarantee you a certain interest rate. Right? This is simple kind of business transactions. Except that when you need a whole lot really quickly and things are getting a little crazy, you have to give people more money. So they'll loan you money. Higher yields to attract buyers, right? Especially when like China and Japan are not really helping out on that, purchasing our debt. I know we don't like it. They're not doing that now because we're in the middle of a trade war with everybody. If you don't get that straightened out, then what happens is those bonds have to get issued to run the government. You get higher and higher interest rates on them, and that pushes things like mortgages, credit cards, business loans, car loans, all that kind of stuff also goes up. Now, Janet Yellen, who I would say was one of the worst Treasury secretaries in history, tried the same thing when this was coming up again. And that's exactly what happened. It just increased the deficit, raised interest rates, and by the time we got things going again, it was hard to pull it back. The debt ceiling, which at one point was supposed to be like some kind of guardrail against this reckless borrowing, is at best symbolic now, right? It's routinely suspended or raised or waived or whatever. Everybody gets right to the edge of this brinksmanship, lets our checking account and that TGA, in other words, our savings account we're using to run the money until the budget gets going, drawn down, and then they waive it anyway. So then the more drawdown you get on the government checking account, the more they have to put back in it. because it is the savings account to run government. And so the longer they dither, the more interest you usually have to add to the bonds to get people to buy them. So that starts raising interest rates. I know this is kind of a weirdly complex situation, but if you just think of it like this, is that if you spend down your savings because you're on strike, let's say, you're not going to work, and then you need to fill that savings back up because it has to be kept at a certain level, otherwise you're in real trouble. Because you spend it down just to keep going while you're not working correctly, why nobody's authorized you to get your paycheck, let's say. What are you going to do? You got to borrow some money for a while. Now, is somebody going to loan you money at the same rate? No. They're going to want more for that because they know you're in difficult times. That's what happens to us. We got to get this thing done. Just find a place and play your hand. All right, folks. I'd like to change gears a little bit here. And this is still Rick Widener getting it right on KNZZ, KGLN, the internet, podcasting, and whatnot. Thanks for sticking with us. And we are changing topics a bit from segment to segment because I had some notes that I wanted to get to. This one is something that I wanted to talk about that frankly was spurred earlier this week when I was listening to a podcast, and one of the people who host the podcast is Konstantin Kisin. Okay, and the podcast is called Triggernometry, not trigonometry, but Triggernometry. Really good. You can find it on Spotify, a few other places if you want to listen to something like this. And I was listening to it when I was getting ready to work one morning because I don't know. I switch around between the radio and a podcast and so forth just as I move around to just see what's going on. But this is always a good one. And they interview some very interesting people lots of times. And what he wanted to talk about to us, as in Americans, is about Vladimir Putin. Because Konstantin, as you might guess, is a Russian. And his family, and he grew up in Russia, he kind of knows Russia. And he spent a lot of time in the United States and in Europe. And he and his partner there have kind of a comedy team and things as well as this. And they just sort of got into this serious business sort of by accident. And people liked them exploring these topics. And so they took off. This is how these podcasts go, is lots of times people back into them. Joe Rogan didn't think he was going to be where he's at now. Remember, we've talked about this before. He usually started out with running the MMA stuff and then came across things that were interesting, thought he had a podcast, and brought people in on other topics just because he was interested in it, and found out that a lot of other people are interested in those things too. And so we got going. The same thing here. But he wanted people in the West, especially in the United States, to kind of understand Vladimir Putin in context with Russia. Soviet Union, Russia, whatever you say, depending on when you're looking at it. Because there's a lot of historical and cultural undercurrents that shape what goes on in that country, and especially his leadership and how he works. And this has a lot to do with trying to, quote, negotiate with him and his country. We don't understand the history of the Russians and how it produces people like Vladimir Putin. Because in the West, particularly in America, we tend to view these political actors through our own cultural bias, right? Expect others to want what we want, fear what we fear, and play by the same moral and institutional values we claim to uphold. I wrote some of this down when I was thinking about it. Russia's not the West, though. And I've said this before, Russia never had a Magna Carta, never had a Jefferson, never had a civil society built on individual liberty in the way we defined it anyway. Russia's whole culture, political especially, was created out of just crazy stuff. Almost all of it was autocracy. Invasion, expansion, collapse, hanging on for survival. I mean, the Mongols had overrun Russia for almost 240 years. And they were not nice to the Russians. It was a terrible time. They pillaged, as we know how pillaging goes, burning, raping, taking what they wanted. And it went on for almost as long as we've been a country. So that's in their history. And when you look through the rest of the history, it doesn't get a lot better sometimes. For instance, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, right, there was like this vacuum. You had the 1913 revolution and eventually the rise of the Soviet Union, and it just sort of rolled on, and once again, it fit the pattern. It was an autocracy of one sort. It pretended to be other things simply because it was trying to fit in with the rest of the world, but it was the same kind of thing. An autocratic empire, essentially, where people were used to being trod upon, and the best thing they thought they could get was perhaps not being trod upon quite as hard. They didn't have the same kind of ideas about individual liberty or anything that we do. We expect them to sort of respond the same way. They don't know what we're talking about to some extent. And Vladimir Putin's really a product of that. Remember, Putin was born in, I'm trying to think, like 52 or something like that. So he grew up in the Stalin era when things were really, and things like famines, the purges of various, and this happened before the World War II as well, the purges of people in the military and society, the elimination of all sorts of quasi-political threats, all this stuff was going on, and it had gone on before. This is not the first time it happened, but it was just continued by Stalin and more systematized. So this is what he grew up with, right? This is how you rose to power. Not becoming popular and kissing babies and telling people there's going to be chicken in every pot. And because there had been so many times in Russian history that there had been a leaderless period where there had been revolution. Well, let's just take the revolution that brought on the Communist Party into power. But there's more than those throughout their history. And what Russians really learned was that if you don't have somebody strong to hold things together, it's really bad, and anything can happen. So they look for a leader that has a different kind of idea of power and control that we would in the West. It's not so much derived from the will of the people. It's derived from the people's will to hold things together and not go berserk in terms of things falling apart, civil wars, all this kind of stuff. Now, when you get to the point where the Soviet Union collapses, and it collapses because it, like we all know, it ran out of money. Its economy was not built in a way that was going to work. Communism doesn't work. Socialism doesn't work. And people don't work because they want to everybody work the same and then split it all up, which is what some people like communism think what happens. Not what happens. It just becomes a serf noble society. They just call the serfs different things and the nobles different things, but it's the same. And that's the kind of thing that's been in Russia for a long time. Well, it's not going to work when you're competing in a world where everybody has a little bit of input into the global markets. Now, this has always been that way. I mean, everybody had to trade with somebody, but it got more and more apparent. And it lasted longer with the Soviet Union than it normally would have because of World War II. After World War II, for many reasons, and you can look at Yalta Conference and you can look at Churchill and FDR, we left Eastern Europe in the hands of the Russians. Why did we do that? Well, we didn't want to fight with them. There's a lot of reasons, and we could spend a lot of time talking about that, and maybe we will in the future. But for a long time, the Soviet Union's economy was not great at all. Pretty much drained resources out of these Eastern European countries. They were captive markets for Russian products. They had skilled people to do different things than the Russians did. And as a matter of fact, the East Germans, who they had, tried to crush completely, became some of their major sources of things like, chemical factories, many of the scientific things, sort of engineering side of stuff. And that allowed the Soviet Union to just keep going a lot longer than they would have if they didn't have that sort of resource to plunder, because that's what they did. They plundered Eastern Europe. And that kept them afloat for a long time. But at some point, it just wasn't going to keep going. And President Reagan understood that. He understood that if you contained them somewhat, where they couldn't get access to new people to subjugate, drain money off of, whatever you want to call it, and then put them in a position where they had to try and keep up with the rest of the world, they couldn't afford to do it. And of course, the way you do that is the one thing that they were most concerned about, their military. The percentage of the domestic product of the Soviet Union was almost half of it was geared towards military expenditures. At the time, ours was nowhere near that. And we had more sophisticated weaponry. We had really a better deployment service. We were more places. And we just kept upping the ante. Many of you will remember the Star Wars idea, not this movie, and the terrible, terrible legacy is now left in these programs they tried to come out with, these movies the last few years. Awful. Anyway, the idea was we're going to build a weapon system that is really going to put us far ahead of you. And it's going to make it so we're not afraid of you at all because we're going to, be able to shoot your stuff down. The same thing that Trump is talking about with his Golden Dome. Well, everybody who didn't like Reagan, and that was pretty much everybody with a D after their name, said, oh, I can't do that. It's not possible. We don't have the science. We don't have anything. Some of that was true. But we also couldn't get to the moon when Kennedy said we were going to get to the moon the next day either. We had to develop it. So we moved that direction. The Soviet Union tries to keep up with it, cannot do it. The economy falls apart. They have too much money in it. They get bogged down in Afghanistan. Huge amounts of money get spent in there. They get nothing out of it. And finally, the economy gets so bad that something has to give. And, of course, it does. You end up with, eventually you get Boris Yeltsin, but you get Gorbachev, who tries to salvage something out of this mess. Right? It was perestroika, right? And eventually they tipped their toe into what we thought was sort of a quasi, economic model, sort of, they're becoming, sort of like us. They're learning about the capitalist system. Not really. A little bit. They certainly learned a lot about how to be gangsters, which they have always had. But there was a lot of these oligarchs we heard about, and a lot of them were interesting, like they controlled fertilizer and things like that. Yeah, well, they were just a little bit beyond what we might think of as, a crime family in the United States during the 30s, 40s. They just happened to be, sort of legitimate because they supported the right people in the government. But they never really got the whole economy thing going. Now, that doesn't mean that things haven't improved in the Soviet Union and now it's now Russia after Boris Yeltsin. And then Yeltsin handed this country over to, Putin. Putin's been running this thing for 26 years. That's a while. And he doesn't have any intention of getting thrown out. He's not going to let things go so far south that he's going to get thrown out of there, because getting thrown out of power with the Russians is not like losing an election where you can go to Martha's Vineyard and, write books and things like that. You're very likely to disappear. Or if you're lucky, like Khrushchev, you may get replaced and allowed to run a hydroelectric plant someplace outside of Minsk or something, That was a lucky way to do it. So you don't want that to happen. So things have to be kept going. And they get kept going by a little bit of what we call capitalism and a little bit of largesse on the part of the West. And just like we're doing with China, we thought that, once they understand how we do business and, constitutional Jeffersonian democracy and how that market works, they'll fall into line. Yeah, that didn't happen. It's not going to happen with China either. At some point, they don't know what we're talking about. And they don't understand why we're doing that, because for them, they don't think it works. It might work if they tried it, but they're not going to try it. Why? They have absolutely no grounding in it. It doesn't make sense to them. And their history is such that every time you try something radically different, things fall apart. Everybody has a war against everybody. China's the same way, the warlords period, all this kind of stuff. And things really go south. So the best thing to do is maintain power. Tinker with it a little bit. Strong leaders. Not strong like we think of, like, maybe President Trump or President Reagan or even Margaret Thatcher or something, but really strong men, you might call them, autocrats, quasi-dictators, full-time dictators like Stalin. Those guys did the one thing that they held the thing together. And while it wasn't good, it was thought of as better than what happens when you try something new and things fall apart. The Russians like to believe themselves to be a great nation because in many ways they are. They've had moments of greatness. They're a big country. They've had all sorts of things they've done. They've won wars. They've, survived all sorts of things. And surviving some of these things has made them aware that they're tough. They're tough people. And so they like the idea that they're tough, and they like strength. They like resilience. Now, we kind of roll our eyes at that. Oh, it's just propaganda. Russians aren't being manipulated. They want to restore what they think of as the great power that they were and their national identity. And because we don't understand their cultural and historical context, we lose the ability to make sound judgments. We think Putin's a crazy guy. Like he's like out of a Bond movie. Oh, he's crazy. Even President Trump said he's gone crazy. He might be crazy in a certain way, but he's not crazy in the way that we're thinking about it, because we don't see him in his real setting, his milieu, as it were. We think he's cornered, isolated, irrational. How many times have you heard that? Last 3 years especially, with what's going on in Ukraine. Has it proven to be true? No, not really. He's not any of those things exactly. He is strategic. He's cold-blooded. And if you look at him, he's been consistent. His actions aren't just that of a crazy man or just arbitrarily doing one thing after another, and which you sort of see in North Korea. I mean, they have kind of a trajectory, but there's enough nutty stuff that goes on in there that, they may blow themselves up or somebody else up, but their focus is not very good. It doesn't mean we have to like the way the Russians do business, or the Chinese for that matter, but we have to understand it, right? When people in America approach, Vladimir, if I may call him that assumes he wants to be part of the club. Everybody, hey, we'll just get along, we'll share and share alike, let's go out and ride around on our golf carts and make deals. No. He's not going to change his ideology. He's not going to think NATO is a good idea, because the whole purpose of NATO was to, in their minds, threaten them. And they had the Warsaw Pact. Now that's fallen apart. So they're not liking that very well. They're constantly trying to project force, keep things going, and Putin wants to do that. Now, Kissen in their podcast pointed out that, and I thought this was interesting. He said, we're fighting a chess match with someone who grew up playing a different game entirely. He plays for keeps, compromises weakness, soft power is just showing off and not getting anything done, and he thinks that we don't have the will to do something. He might think that President Trump has the will to do things, but it doesn't look like he has the support to do much. And when President Trump talks about peace, Putin thinks, well, that's all fine and good. But if I'm more bellicose, maybe I get more stuff. And that's all it is. These are different civilizations than ours. They see things differently. They have a different mythology. They have everything about them is just, I don't know. It's different enough from us that we do not have an ability to comprehend how it works, right? We are putting everything in our perspective, not in theirs. So the closer we get to being able to do that, the closer we understand these folks. And President Trump is able to deal with these, I'm confident. But he's going to have to think a little bit more about who he's dealing with. The art of the deal in the West and the art of the deal in Russia, and for that matter, China, are different deals. Doesn't mean you can't figure them out, but you have to take them into account. And the left, and to some extent people on the right, saying, "Oh, Putin's crazy." Well, he's crazy and maybe sort of in our narrative, but not in theirs. He may not be a good guy. He's not. He may not care if he kills people. He doesn't. He may not care how many of his own people get killed to accomplish what he wants to, and he doesn't really care about that either, if you look at it. And a lot of Russian leaders have been exactly like that. It's not like he came along and did something surprising. There's plenty of Russian leaders that have thought the exact same way. Some of them that were much worse than Putin in terms of the way they did business. So the kinds of things that dissuade us from doing certain steps and getting involved in things, they don't work on them, right? We're not excusing somebody like Putin or Russia or what they're doing in Ukraine or anything else, but you got to understand what their thoughts are. This is one of the reasons why I think President Trump talks about peace. He thinks people want peace. Well, for the most part, the average people want peace. People in Russia, peace is okay, but they want to make sure things don't fall apart. They want strength. And as long as they perceive Vladimir Putin as strong and holding things together and raising national pride and all this kind of things, they're probably going to go along with it. And they have a long history of losing a lot of men and resources in battles until you grind it down and either stalemate or win, like World War II, or if you go back when they were fighting Sweden, I mean, they're willing to take a lot more damage than we are because they've had so much damage the whole history of their country, area, region. It's completely different than what we think. We have conquered, and we've never been invaded. We've never had our cities blown up. We've never had people come in, take over our country, treat us badly for 100 years or so. None of those kinds of things. So we have to be aware that they're going to think about this differently. And I think we can get around it. But I think we need to watch what our leaders do and the way they approach things. At some point, we have to decide, are we going to really get tough and take a chance? Or are we going to let the guy have something and walk away and draw another line in the sand and really mean it? We'll have to see.
Folks, thanks for listening.
See you next week.
Listen, if you'd like to listen to more and you want to maybe perhaps have someone else listen to our podcast, you can do so either by going right to our webpage, politicalviking.com, or therickWagnerShow.com. Both of them take you there. You can get links right directly to our podcast, or you can hear our podcast on Podbean, on iTunes, and Spotify, and a couple others. So you can find us. We appreciate it if you do. And if you've heard the show, you want somebody else to hear it, that's a good way to send it to them. Thanks for listening.